Who would win between the Avatar and a space plant snake? Which lesson is the best one to learn? Find that out and more coming up right now. Another RC weekend has come and gone, and that means another metagame breakdown here from myself, Optimus Tom. We had an RC in Portland that broke out the standard format featuring the recently released Lorwyn Eclipse, which means that the metagame is going to be shaken up in a couple of different ways. Ways that people expected, and ways that people definitely did not expect. So if you haven't seen one of these breakdown videos before, we're going to be going over the overall metagame breakdown and the picture of how the tournament in Portland went, including highlighting some interesting decks. Then we're going to look at my popularity tier analysis, where I break down the decks by the amount that were played in the room and then compare them against the other decks in the same tier, so you get more of an idea of like what to expect when you go to an RCQ event and how those decks may go against the field of decks you play against. Then we're going to be looking at two different versions of top 10 win rate decks. The first one is going to have no sample size whatsoever, so if there is only a singleton deck and it did very well, such as the winning deck at the event, it's going to be on that list. And then the second one is going to be looking at decks that had at least 4 copies in the room in order to qualify for this top 10 win rate list. The first one is going to be more for the brewers and people trying to find some secret tech in the standard format, and the other one is going to be for people who are looking at what decks can match up well against the field of a large tournament like this and try to find a slight edge of a deck that may be an undiscovered gem in the standard format. We're then going to be taking a look at the top 10 presence decks based on how many decks were played at Portland in that metagame breakdown, and looking at how they perform head to head against one another. And then because I had some people so generously ask me to do some extra breakdown work, we're also going to highlight how the Izzet lessons list has kind of split in deck construction, and trying to figure out which one of those is actually the best one to bring to a tournament or the Pro Tour and RCQ, whatever you're going to be playing in. But before I throw some numbers at your screen, I had to throw some information about the numbers at your ears, and that's going to be the fact that we are using all of the results from the Melee platform, which has 896 registered players, and thankfully, 0 of them had no deck list and 0 of them had troll deck lists, which means that the only sort of cleaning I had to do was going in and rearranging some of the archetype names. For example, I saw that there was an Izzet Lessons deck that was actually Jeskai and Flyers, so I reorganized that one out of there. There have been 5 specific archetypes that have been added or changed around, which means that if you look at like Frank Karsten's breakdown or Azorius I's breakdown over on social media, their numbers may look a little bit different than the numbers that I have, and that's going to be the reason why they don't entirely line up when we go through like win rate or just even the metagame presence of the decks at the RC this weekend. And my analysis is going to be doing all of the rounds and all of the games, so we're including the quarterfinals, the semifinals, and the finals. And of course, buys are not counted in win rate, but ties are, unless you're looking at the win rate minus ties metric. So without further ado, now it's time to throw some numbers at your face. At the regional championship this weekend, we have a nice even 100 different deck archetypes in the room, which means that when we look at the number of decks that had multiple copies, we get some nice round numbers. The same amount of decks are going to represent their same amount of metagame share, such as the 44 different singleton decks that were in the room, making up 44% of the deck diversity metagame. Now, we're going to be looking at different archetypes that had at least 2 copies in the room. There were 15 of them, so a little bit less there, but still a decent amount here. Then we're going to swap on over to different archetypes with at least 3 copies in the room. We've got 10 for 10%, so we're starting to taper off as we start getting to those multiple copies around the room. Now, deck archetypes with at least 4 different copies in the room had 5. Then there was 5% of this deck share metagame. And then, just to be confusing, if we look at archetypes with 5 decks in the room, there were 4 different types for 4%, just to confuse everybody there. However, if we take a look at decks that had either 6 or 7 copies in the room, there were 3 different archetypes that had that for 3% of the deck share metagame. There's only 1 deck archetype that had 8 copies in the room, so just 1% of the deck share metagame. And then we jump up to different archetypes with at least 10 or more copies in the room. There were 15 of those, making up the 15 most played decks in the room. Makes a lot of sense there. Very similar to the 2 copy decks in the room, 15% of this deck share metagame. Now, of all those decks in the room, Izzet Lessons took home the crown as the most played deck at the RC. 145 decks made up 16.2% of the metagame overall, showing that, yeah, the Monument and Artist Talent deck still is alive and kicking after last round. Simic Ouroboroid was not far behind on Izzet Lessons' heels with 134 different decks, meaning 15% of the field was throwing down Badgermole Cub, Quantum Riddler, and Ouroboroid all in the same pile. Jeskai Control did rise up to be the 3rd most played deck at this RC. 79 different pilots made up 8.8% of the metagame share, while Sultai Reanimator, a different tricolor wedge, 73 different pilots with 8.1% of the metagame share, trying to get their hands on as many of those new Evoke Elementals as possible. Bant Airbending, also after winning one of the previous events, ticked up in pilot tier, making up 61 decks or 6.8% of the metagame overall, while Dimir Midrange was finally on a downturn. 59 pilots brought the deck to the event for 6.6% of the metagame share overall, even though Lorwyn Fairies are pretty appealing for Dimir players. Mono Red Aggro had 34 pilots, making up 3.8% of the metagame share, on a bit of a downward trend from the last events as well, while Boros Aggro was on a slight uptick here. 24 pilots made up 2.7% of the metagame share. Selesnya Landfall is the only landfall deck in the top 10 presence decks. 23 pilots splashed white, making up 2.6% of the metagame share overall, while Azorius Control sneaks in as the 10th most popular deck at the event. 15 pilots cut the red and made up 1.7% of the overall metagame. Now it's time for us to shift gears away from what made up the event as a whole and just focus on what was most popular at the event using my popularity tier analysis. Now this section looks to identify what was played the most at an event and compare it to the other decks within the same tier of popularity using a distribution of deck archetypes at the event, which uses standard deviation to assign tiers from D at 1 deviation below the average all the way up to S, the highest deviation above the average. Now this does a little more than just look at how high the metagame share was and can reaffirm if a deck was a good choice for an event at all. Now while this is not a be-all end-all overview of the format, this analysis looks to help in preparation for your own events at your LGS or online, as you can expect to see more of the higher tier decks compared to the lower tier ones, but then you can also assess if you need to prepare more or less for them based on their performance. Now, less pilots than the last couple of events we looked at combined, as well as the fact that there was a more even spread of decks across the event, meant that there were multiple S-tier decks as far as popularity went at this event, although looking at the results, it doesn't look like they were S-tier as far as results go. Now, Simic Ouroboroid was actually the list that fared the best out of these top 3 most played decks at the RC, with basically a 50% even win rate, which basically goes to show that it could be pilot scale, it could be matchup based, and it could just be that the deck is pretty solid overall, but not necessarily as overpowered as everybody was kind of thinking it would be. Likewise, a lot of the pilots that were bringing Izzet Lessons to the field were not having as good of a time. A below 50% win rate at 47.9% is a far cry from the 50-something% win rates that we're used to having it put up at some previous events, and it may just be due to the fact that people are more prepared for lessons, that they are trying to tech themselves against different matchups rather than what they actually played against at the field, or it could just be the fact that the lessons decks themselves are having a little bit of a hard time figuring out what to do against the field. Now later on in the video, we will go a little bit more into detail about Izzet Lessons, some of the card choices, specifically Storm Chaser's talent and not, and we'll do a little bit more of a breakout on the deck there and talk about it in full. Now, Jeskai Control in and of itself was supposed to be pretty solid against a lot of these Ouroboroid lists, as well as a lot of the decks that are going to be more creature-based. However, of all of these S-tier decks, it did the worst overall against the field, which just may go to show again that with decks like Sultai Reanimator getting a boost, Bant Airbending having a better mana base, as well as picking up in popularity overall, and just some of these decks shifting away from playing just multiple creatures on the battlefield to deal with, Jeskai Control may have to shake up their interaction package to see if it can really hang and contend when the top decks in the room aren't going to be Ouroboroid flavors down the line. Now, we'll take a look at the head-to-head matchup matrix later on to see where Jeskai and Control can improve those specific matchups, but in a blind event, we know that you're going to have to do something a little different than what they were doing at the RC if you want to be better off against the broad field of standard decks that are emerging in Lorwyn Eclipse. Now, on the A tier of decks, we have 3 different decks that had some varying results. Some are on the uptrend and some are on the downward spiral. Now, Dimir Midrange is a deck that I do like to pick on, mostly because I enjoyed playing it in the past, but it does continue to have sub 50% results across these larger events, meaning that it might just not have the tools to deal with the large majority of the field as a whole. I know that Day of Black Sun is a very good board wipe edition that Dimir Midrange has gotten from Avatar, but I haven't really seen it have other tools to fight off the Ouroboroid deck specifically. Requiting Hex is a tool that it could use to kill Badger Cub specifically, but it really doesn't do anything against the Formidable Speakers and the Ouroboroids and just the overrun effects that deck can eventually put out there. It's also not the greatest against Quantum Bridler. So to me, Midrange needs to retool a couple of things, and I'm not entirely sure if just putting some fairy tokens into play is going to be the way to go about it. Now, Sultai Reanimator, speaking of decks that did get upgrades from Lorwyn Eclipse, not only do you get Requiting Hex, but you get the package of Evoke Elementals as well. Wistfulness and Deceit were the 2 main ones that went into Sultai Reanimator, giving them a Thought Seize as well as an Exile Naturalize effect to fight against the hate cards. Now, even though Sultai Reanimator only had a slightly above 50% win rate, if you recall from the last video, it was rocking something around like the mid 40%, which means that these changes have had a positive effect on its matchup against the field as a general deck, so that just kind of raises its choice in these closed deck list or open field events as something that could contend with the rest of the decks in the standard metagame. Now, Bant Airbending was a winner of a previous event, as well as just getting a lot of upgrades overall. Formidable Speakers, Wistfulness as well in this list, and then we also of course have the access to all of the shock lands that the Bant mana base was missing. That ups the consistency, the tutor package ups the consistency, and the combo just being very difficult to deal with, especially when people are dealing with creatures like Ouroboroid on the field rather than dealing with spells on the stack. Now Bant Airbending is looking at one of the better overall win rates against the field at 55.3% on the weekend, which I can only imagine means that we're going to see way more of this deck on the ladders online, as well as at your local RCQ events. So you need to have a game plan against what Aang and Appa and Doc Arlok are going to be doing. Now, Mono Red Aggro winds up sitting in B tier all on its lonesome, as the deck did kind of go up in win rate overall, but is still stuck just below 50% win rate. Now, a lot of this has to do with the fact that the Mono Red Aggro lists are shifting a little bit. You do have the ping list with Ohir Axonil as well as Razorkin Needlehead in the list, while some have shifted away from Ohir and are just main decking Magebane Lizard to try to deal with a lot of the spells that are flying around the battlefields or on the stacks right now. So while Mono Red did have a slightly better event this time around, I'm not entirely sure if the configuration that Mono Red is running here is kind of like agreed upon. There are a bunch of different lists that are floating around, and we may take a look at some of the card choices individually later when we go into the head-to-head matchup matrix to see which ones Red is packing that you should bring to an RCQ type event, or again, some of the more popular decks in the room in general. But I still think there are qualms with the fact that a lot of these ping-based damage effects trigger off of card draw, and there's a lot of card selection in the format right now, like putting 3 cards into your hand, or looking at the top X and putting 2 into your hand, or looking at the top 5 with stock up and putting 2 into your hand. There's not a lot of actual draw a card effects that can be punished in some of these lists, and in those cases I think that you may want to wind up going fast rather than trying to death by 1,000 cut somebody with Red. C tier winds up having a plethora of decks where only 3 of them fall into the top 10 presence, and the rest of them are just kind of tagging along for the ride, and in some cases looking better than some of those top 10 presence decks. Now, Boros Aggro unfortunately sits here at a 40.2% win rate, after in my last video I was saying how I liked the Boros versions better than what the Mono Red versions were doing. Well, I guess, you know, my knowledge just goes to show here, as Boros Aggro is the worst performing deck in this popularity tier. Maybe the the Boros lists are not as good as I thought they were. However, big highlights are still the pair of Landfall decks. Selesnya Landfall, 53.4%, and that is one of the top 10 presence decks. And then Mono Green Landfall, rocking 58.8% win rate against the field, although there are less pilots at this event than there were previous events, so only 14 pilots, a little bit of a smaller sample size, but it's still rocking a pretty solid win rate. Much like the Golgari Ouroboroid list. Now, there are a couple of different types of decks in here. We might wind up talking about them a little later in the video when we look at high win rate decks, because this 55.4% win rate deck archetype does kind of shoot up in looking at these popularity decks. It is the second highest win rate overall behind the mono green Landfall deck. There are a couple, like I said, a couple different lists doing a couple different things. We'll talk about them in a little bit, but the rest of these decks on this list here, some fan favorites like Golgari Midrange, not quite as good as the Golgari Ouroboroid decks. These ones are really running Unholy Annex. We could just see how far that card has fallen in standard, 41.6% win rate overall. And the Izzet looting list, putting a different spin on the Izzet decks, 46.3% win rate overall. That was one of the decks I was considering running at the LCQ, so go figure, it's also not a great deck overall. Azorius Control, even though it is not running red like Jeskai, it actually had a worse win rate overall, 43% against the field. Just goes to show that maybe the red is what's propping up some of that win rate from the Jeskai side. There's also a cool Sultai Elementals list. There were 11 pilots that wanted taking this one to the RC, but unfortunately only wound up rocking a 47.1% win rate. And a lot of these deck archetypes are trying out some new cards or based entirely around new cards like the Sultai Elementals list. So I wouldn't really deter that from you if you want to take a look at what the deck was doing and see if there are some improvements to be made, because this was legitimately release weekend and some of these lists may have been handicapped by what they could get from the vendors at the event. Let's step away from the popularity contest and instead look at what decks were doing the most winning, regardless of how many copies were in the room at the event. Now, this is going to be looking at overall win rate in the percentage of games won, not total wins or total games played. This is going to allow us to look for some of those sleeper OP decks, even though they weren't out in full force this weekend, and it's going to be able to put that in perspective based on how successful they were in the hands of smaller amounts of pilots. Now, the caveat is these are 2-day events, which means that some of these lists could have not made day 2 despite having a positive record. So as always, keep in mind the sample size because it does matter when you're thinking about breaking the format. RC winner Tristan Wylde-LaRue brought a brew of a deck that basically wound up running the core of what makes the Ouroboroid decks so good and turning it up to an 11 as far as toolbox decks go. Now, the main core of Badgermole Cub and Nature's Rhythm, in addition to just a plethora of monodorks, is what makes the 4-color Rhythm deck really hum. Now, notably absent from this list, however, is Ouroboroid. In its place, there is a plethora of search effects. Formidable Speaker is one of the newer cards from Lorien Eclipse. Of course, it shows Jean-Emmanuel Deprat depicted as an elf who can discard a card and then search for a creature and put it into your hand. Similarly, Bright Glass Gearhulk, even though it is double Selesnya mana pips, can find a plethora of 1-drops from within your deck, whether it be one of your monodorks or a Mockingbird, which can be used to copy something big that you have in play. Now, Quantum Riddler also makes an appearance in this deck, which is basically going to be able to help restock your hand, as well as being something really good to find with all of this stuff, as well as a plethora of 1-ofs like Meringue River Regent, and of course, Craterhoof Behemoth. Now, the 4th color in this list comes from Explosive Prodigy, which is a new Lorien Eclipse card that can basically ETB and deal 4 damage to something, so it gets rid of a lot of problematic ground blockers. You also get access to great sideboard and main deck hate cards like Seam Rip from White, as well as being able to run cards like the Glenelendra Guardian from Lorien Eclipse that you're able to have a counterspell on hand, or even just running a 1 of Ouroboroid in the sideboard. Regardless, there are a ton of different tutor targets between main deck and sideboard that can deal with a plethora of decks in standard, and we see why Tristan was able to win the entire event with this deck. Dimir Elementals is a pretty cool name because you don't normally get to hear the Dimir deck being the one to run a plethora of elemental type cards. However, introduction of Deceit, Emptiness, Wistfulness, and Sunderflock gave this deck a plethora of big things that it was able to evoke into play. Now, there are two ways that Dimir specifically can utilize this evoke cost in a positive way, even though they have to hit the graveyard eventually. The first is going to be Superior Spider-Man in a Sultai Reanimator kind of style of package. Any of these ETB evoke creatures are now going to be able to be copied by Superior Spider-Man. It will enter as one of those elementals, and so long as you pay the blue, black, or whatever colors, you will get the effects because they are cast triggers, the same way that the Sultai deck kind of cheats on the cast effect of its own Bringer of the Last Gift. Now, the other side is the scam package, because you may forget that Undying Malice and Not Dead After All are standard legal cards. We had these be a menace in Modern previously, and although you can't do them for free, doing them for a total of 3 mana and getting a giant 5 or 6 power body in play is still pretty good. We're also looking to utilize Sunderflock to its maximum, being able to bounce all non-elementals from the battlefield back to their owner's hands. Thankfully, we have basically all elementals. Overlord of the Baelmerk helps us fuel the graveyard as well for Superior Spider-Man, as well as being able to get back any of the evoke elementals that we need to cast early on, and Moonshadow makes an appearance as just a growing threat as we're able to trigger it, removing a counter from it off of our Overlord of the Baelmerk and all of the evokes that wind up hitting the graveyard. The sideboard is a little bit like rough around the edges. It kind of just looks like a normal Dimir sideboard, and I think that there could be a couple of extra cards that we could suss out of putting in here. Torpor Orb is an interesting one, because even though it's a sideboard card to kind of stop some of the green decks, it also works beneficially for you because it stops your evoke from triggering. So there's a lot of cool things we can do here, and a lot of these elemental lists are going to be having a very similar vein of attack, and I'm going to be interested to see which one comes out as the best one to run in Standard. Now, Jeskai Midrange is a list that we have seen at some previous events. This is the Shiko plus other creatures package of really cool things to do, and Amy James wound up taking the list all the way to top 16, just 16th place at the RC this weekend. Now, Shiko is, of course, going to be able to have a plethora of 3 mana spells to be able to bring back when it ATBs, but there's also going to be a package of 3 or less mana creatures that can also wind up being benefited by Shiko. Aang Swiss Savior plays a very good tempo speed spell in this deck, and Ashling Rekindled, or Ashling Rhinebound, coming in from Lauren Eclipsed, gives the deck an additional little source of card advantage, as well as on the flip side, adding additional mana to its mana pool to cast spells with mana value 4 or greater. That means you can cast a Shiko ahead of the curve, or with double white on the battlefield, you can Day of Judgment and clear a board of being overrun by the Badger Mole or Ouroboroid decks a lot earlier than some of the other Jeskai lists are going to be able to do. This, of course, gives you access to all of the premium Jeskai control-esque sideboard cards, and because this list is opting to play way more smaller creatures, you have Clarion Conqueror, which shuts off Badger Mole Cup hard, Voice of Victory, which shuts off Interaction hard, and Tishana's Tidebinder, which shuts off hate pieces very, very hard. So the deck has a lot of kind of moving parts that can do some really cool things, and although it can play a control style game, it does eventually just want to beat people down with a 4/5 dragon or potentially a flipped Aang into Aang and La Ocean's Fury. There's also still 2 copies of Gwen Stacy or Ghost Spider in the list that's able to wind up kind of impulsing the top card of your library, so you can play that one, or flipping on over into the Ghost Spider side, having a 4/4 Flying Vigilance haste that whenever you play something in exile, you put a +1/+1 counter on it to grow, so you have an additional large threat besides Shiko to help you end the game. Izzet Elementals had a couple of copies in the room, although a lot of them are kind of doing a very similar thing the Dimir deck was doing, utilizing a lot of these Evoke Elementals as well as Sunderflock to really take over the board state. This time around, though, the Izzet list were utilizing Roaming Throne, which is going to be able to turn a lot of those ETB and Evoke effects into double effects. So that was going to basically be accruing a ton of advantage, finding 2 lands off Vibrance, drawing 4 cards off of Wistfulness, or Thought-Seizing 2 cards off of Deceit. Now, Flame Braider was also utilized in this deck to be able to kind of ramp into some of these elementals a little bit sooner. And of course, like I said, Sunderflock basically being a one-sided upheaval for your opponent's creatures is a very powerful type of effect to have in a list like this. Now, there are a couple of not quite Izzet colored cards in the sideboard and Izzet lands to help with this. We have Breeding Pool in the main deck, and 4 copies of Cavern of Souls are going to help you cast some of the other elementals or changelings from your sideboard, like Chomping Changeling, which can remove a lot of problematic enchantments and artifacts that you may wind up running into, but you still wind up having a bunch of creature removal in your sideboard. 3 copies of Seer, 4 copies of Pyroclasm, and then 2 copies of Spider Sense to bounce some of those elementals back to your hand, and you can of course utilize the main deck Springleaf Drum to tap them to bring back to your hand while web slinging the Spider Sense, or adding the extra mana to your mana pool before they hit the graveyard from Evoke. Mono White Control made another appearance in Standard, this time in the hands of Nathan Johnson and taking 65th place overall at a 10-5 record. Now, this is going to be basically a lot of white haymakers as well as Day of Judgment, Get Lost, and just Aang's Iceberg and Seam Rip. So like tons of removal. We have Enduring Innocence to help us draw some cards when we have some tokens enter the battlefield. And the way that we have tokens enter the battlefield is Base of the Bounding Spring, Overlord of the Mistmords, and Big Bad Elspeth Stormslayer right there in the center of your screen, which is going to double a lot of those token making effects as well. Fountain Port is going to be a utility land that gets used to its maximum here, and since we are only a monocolor deck, Sunken Citadel helps us cheat on the mana cost in order to use that every single turn starting from the early parts of the game. Post sideboard, we have copies of Voice of Victory, Authority of the Consuls, Torpor Orb, Rest in Peace, tons and tons of just kind of hate pieces coming out from the mono white side that are able to really shut down what a lot of different decks in Standard are going to want to be able to do. Now, there are a couple copies of Sunbillow Verge in the main deck, and of course those 2 Sunken Citadel that could be declared as red for a singleton Song of Totentans in the sideboard. This is something I haven't necessarily seen before. While the Song of Totentans will put X rats into play, where X is the amount of mana that you wind up tapping and they will gain haste, you can then double that with Elspeth's Stormslayer. So you could, in theory, X equals 5, make 10 1/1s and try to overrun your opponent with literally a swarm of rats. Daniel Kuperman's Gruul Ouroboroid deck is something that I'm kind of surprised we haven't seen before, although it's in a bit of a different configuration than I would have expected. We wind up adding Vibrance and Overlord of the Boiler Bilges to this deck in order to, have your flavor of Ouroboroid this time around. Vibrance is going to be a new Evoke Elemental that for double red will deal 3 damage to any target, a quick little lightning bolt, and for double green we'll be able to search your library for a land card, reveal it, and put it into your hand, then shuffle, gaining you 2 life. So you can, in a pinch, just find your red source or find the lands that you need off of, a Badgermole Cub Earthbended land or a Badgermole Cub tapped mana dork to do so. Now, Nature's Rhythm, of course, is going to have a bit of a nombo here, as you can't necessarily get the effects of Vibrance from doing so. However, you are going to be able to find things like said Overlord of the Boiler Bilges to deal 4 damage to something, Nova Hellkite to come on in and scream from the skies, and then of course Craterhoof Behemoth to rock the entire world. Now, there are a couple copies of Burst Lightning in the main deck, which could just be a hedge against some of the more aggressive or other Badgermole Cub decks, as sort of the red version of Seam Rip that we see coming in, but the sideboard gets to utilize 4 copies of Seer, a copy of Boulder Dash, and then just a bunch of the similar kinds of green cards that we see in a lot of the Ouroboroid list, Sorok Elusive Hunter, Vivian Reed, Keen-Eye Curator, and a copy of Origin of Metal Bending. First we had Dimir, then we had Izzet. Now we have actual Temur elementals. This version of the deck is going to be kind of similar to what the Izzet version was doing. However, instead of utilizing the Roaming Throne, we have Outcaster Trailblazer, which is going to sort of be a up the beanstalk type effect that is going to wind up drawing us cards whenever one of these large Evoke elementals hits the battlefield. We still have Ashling in order to give us a little bit of card advantage, as well as flip over and give us some mana, but we wind up packing a full bunch of Evoke elementals from Vibrance to Wistfulness, as well as the Sunder Flock that we wind up seeing on the screen here. That is kind of the main payoff for these elemental decks, as well as 3 copies of Quantum Riddler, just to play a pretty strong mid-range card advantage style game. Now, there are 4 copies of Analyze the Pollen in this list, which with these giant elementals potentially hitting our graveyard can be utilized to search for the next big thing from our deck to cast quite early on in the game. Sideboard is going to give us copies of Tishana's Tidebinder, some Paw Patch formations, 4 full copies of Soul Guide Lantern because somebody didn't want to have to deal with opposing elementals in their opponent's graveyards, as well as a copy of Chandra's Spark Hunter that you can kind of shift into a bit more of a mid-rangey deck post sideboard with. I guess the spoiler alert to this sample size doesn't matter win rate section is basically choosing your flavor of elemental or Ouroboroid list. However, there were 3 different pilots that chose Selesnya Ouroboroid, including Gavin Perry, who finished 79th in the highest placing overall. Now, this list did wind up running the latest and greatest hits from the Ouroboroid list, as well as splashing in Elspeth Stormslayer as a high mana payoff. Bright Glass Gearhulk again helps find a lot of your mana dorks, as well as potential sideboard cards or hate cards like Seamrip or Soul Guide Lantern. There's also a copy of Duskrow's Reliquary in the main deck for a little bit of more insurance against some early drops. Now, the big kind of upgrade to this color combination is Brigid Klaxon's Heart or Brigid Doan's Mind, depending on the side that you have it flipped to currently. And while the front side just basically gives you some Kithkin creature tokens, if you flip it on over, it gives you a big mana boost, adding X green or X white, where X is the number of other creatures you control. So Brigid does a lot of work to help you pump out a lot of these extra creatures, or utilize your Nature's Rhythms to find a Craterhoof Behemoth with a ton of things untapped on the battlefield still. Post sideboard, we have some Enduring Innocences and Voice of Victories. We get card draw and permission denial, as well as a plethora of white removal spells. Getting access to Get Lost is pretty powerful, and then we still wind up having some cards like Soul Guide Lantern, Ghost Vacuum, an extra Elspeth, and then even Insidious Fungus in the sideboard, just to deal with a plethora of different standard lists. Now, here's a list that isn't quite a remix of a different flavor of list. In Boros Dragons, again, 4 different pilots brought this deck to the RC, and pilot OrangeAed actually took it to 7th place for a top 8 finish overall. The deck is utilizing Sarkhan, Dragon Ascendant, as well as Momo Friendly Flyer in order to put a bunch of winged beasts onto the battlefield early and ahead of curve, and to just decimate its opponents in doing so. Nova Hellkite, the all-star from the aggro list, is of course in here as a big bad dragon, as well as Twin Moss Stormbrood, which can just be used for charring Bite side, as well as Magmatic Hellkite to deal with some problematic lands that are on the battlefield, specifically some things that Badgermole Cup may be animating. You can destroy target non-basic land an opponent controls. They can search for a basic, but it comes into the battlefield tapped with a stun counter on it and forces them to shuffle. So having a big bad dragon that also works as a bit of a stone rain is pretty solid right now. You, of course, also get the best in the world of removal and burn spells from the Boros colors. Burst Lightnings, Get Lost, but no copies of Lightning Helix in the 75 from the top 8 copy. You do, however, get copies of High Noon, Rest in Peace, Fire Magic, and Sunspine Links in the sideboard to really kind of pick and choose the hate you have in certain matchups with this deck. You then have Exercise, Abrade, Get Lost, just so many ways to remove any problematic permanents your opponents may be putting in against you. I wouldn't be surprised to see Boros Dragons be a little bit more popular in some of the RC events because A, it's a pretty solid deck to put together overall. It does big things, it does fast things, but overall it can kind of play both, and it's just cool to kill people with dragons. Just saying. Azorius Flash is the last of these top 10 archetypes on this side. When sample size doesn't matter, there were 2 different pilots in the room, but pilot Zevin Faust took it to top 58. Actually 58th place overall, top 64 in general, and a 10-5-0 record. Now this deck is kind of something we talked about last video, where I think the evolution of some of these Dimir Flash mid-range threats can go, even though you don't wind up having Kaito, and a combination of Elspeth Stormslayer and a Johnny Outland Chaperone in Zevin's list was one of the areas that they wound up going to in order to kind of replace that Kaito factor. Now Johnny, of course, works as a removal spell for tap creatures, can put a token into the battlefield every single turn, which then gets doubled if you have an Elspeth later on in the game, and then you just get to put any number of non-land permanents with mana value 3 or less from among them onto the battlefield for its ultimate, which is basically a lot of your deck. Now, a lot of that is also going to be interactive pieces. We see Aang Swift Savior, also Aven Interrupter to really kind of play the Flash stall game. It worked really well in tandem with High Noon that you see on your screen here, being able to prevent opponents from playing multiple spells in a single turn, and if they wind up having a removal piece for your High Noon, Aven Interrupter and Aang can just shut down their entire turn by you flashing in on their turn, and then you still have your turn to do whatever you want, like deploying Enduring Curiosity so you can keep drawing cards, Avatars wrathing the board that they actually have, and then High Noon stops them from playing more than one of them when they eventually get to cast spells, or you just get to play removal spells of your own, like 4 copies of Seam Rip and then a couple of copies of Get Lost, which actually Zevin was running 0 copies of Get Lost in this list, but there were some floating around in some other lists. Sideboard gives you, of course, more flash threats like Tishana's Tidebinder, an additional copy of Ajani, and plenty of interaction on the stack. Requisition Raid, we end up having Annul, Disdainful Stroke, Spell Snare, and Wan Shi Tong Librarian to give you that flash Hydroid Crisis type of effect that the deck really likes to see. Now, you may have noticed that a lot of the decks in the previous section were what I like to call one-day wonders. There's maybe 1 or 2 copies of the deck, and they didn't have that deep of a run into the tournament, so we don't have a very large sample size as to test how strong they are against the metagame. Well, this next section is going to be looking at pretty much the exact same win rate statistics that we were looking at previously, only now sample size matters. We are only looking at deck archetypes that had at least 4 or more copies into the room, so you're going to get a better picture of how these decks did against the field, and this is where you're going to be looking for some of those sleeper rogue decks that could break out in the format over the next couple of weeks with some tweaking. Well, we're back with Boros Dragons, as its 62.5 win rate was high enough for it to be the winningest deck at the tournament, even when sample size is factored in. A 30-18-0 record means that the deck had 0 ties as well, so it doesn't really matter if we're looking at win rate minus ties or non-mirror win rate, because there were no mirror matches played amongst these 4 decks either. Regardless though, this Boros Dragons list, in addition to playing Momo and Sarkhan in order to put the big dragons out earlier, had an interesting game plan that was sort of like some hate pieces in the main deck. Clarion Conqueror, of course, is a way to shut off a lot of the Badger Mole decks, while High Noon really shuts down Lessons and, again, some of those green decks that are playing multiple creatures every single turn. On the flip side, you get to run Cavern of Souls, since basically everything we want to cast is a dragon, so that means that we're not going to really be able to have anything get interacted with on the stack. Your opponents really need to have instant speed removal to deal with your threats, otherwise they're going to stick, and we have things like Nova Hellkite that have haste, so it's going to connect for some damage. We still wind up having a couple of instant speed spells on our side with Burst Lightning and Get Lost, and then moving into the sideboard, we have flash threats like Cutsel's Flanker to deal with graveyard-based synergies, and Fire Magic to deal with enlarged small board states. Regardless, the Dragons deck is missing some of these tutory kind of style things that Nature's Rhythm decks have. They are able to make up for a little bit with copies of Maelstrom of the Spirit Dragon as a land that's able to do something very, very similar, but it does cost 4 and sacrifices itself in order to find a dragon from our library and put it into our hand. However, once you wind up having 1 in your hand or 1 on the battlefield, you can protect it and do very good damage to your opponent, so the next one could potentially just be lethal. Mono Green Landfall had another good weekend here at the RC in Portland with a 58.8% win rate overall, and looking at a 60.6% win rate when you discount those 5 ties that are in the 94, 61, and 5 record overall. And the Mono Green Landfall decks have shifted away from things like Tifa in the main deck, and even multiple copies of Bristly Bill, Spine Sour, going down in the amount of copies there, and really honing in on the redundancy and just kind of the consistency plan that you wind up getting from cards like Ice Till Explorer, as well as kind of leaning into that Badger Mole Cub area of the format as well. We still have multiple copies of Earthbender Ascension, as well as Esper Origins, to wind up going for the longer games, or just wind up going a little bit wider once you have a couple of those landfall threats on the battlefield. And then some of the decks actually wind up running Sapling Nursery that came out just this past weekend in Lorien Eclipse. It has affinity for forest, so being mono green is usually where you're going to see this as opposed to the Selesnya lists, and it makes 3/4 green tree folk with reach whenever a land enters the battlefield. So at the end of the day, this thing is going to basically be a substitute for Felidar Reach treat that means that we may not need to be splashing into the Selesnya colors anymore and can stay mono green, since this wants to take advantage of all of the forest. And it does also have the upgrade of being able to exile itself and then give tree folk and forest you control indestructible to end of turn, which also works very well with Badgermole Cub and anything that you're going to be putting counters on with Bossing Say. So at the end of the day, the mono green landfall version did wind up going a little bit better than the Selesnya version here, basically 60% win rate on the weekend. This is going to be the landfall deck to beat in the upcoming events. Simic version of the Kona Omniscience deck got a slight upgrade thanks to Formidable Speaker, as you no longer need to go into white to play the Seriema in order to wind up finding your Kona in the first place, and it no longer restricts you to only finding legends, so you can find your Meringue River regions as well. Now the Simic version still winds up being a little bit more sort of control oriented, as you wind up having multiple copies of Consult the Star Charts, stock up, and then some interaction on the stack like Dispelling Exhale to go along with Lost in the Maze, Omniscience, and of course Kona Rescue Beastie to throw down Omniscience into play, and then Meringue River Regent combo your opponents away. There is also a singleton copy of Terror in the Peaks in Jeff Zhao's 24th placing list that went 11-4-0 overall, which just kind of speeds up the process of killing your opponent, as every single time you loop your Meringue River Regents, you're going to just deal some damage to them on the way in. Now this sideboard from Jeff's deck also was pretty streamlined, with 4 copies of Essence Scatter, 4 Spell Pierce, 4 Spell Snare, and 3 Soul Guide Lanterns. So sometimes sideboard crafting is just that simple and just that easy, but the way that this deck can just kind of pick and choose its interaction on the stack to try to protect what the main plan is going to be doing, where you Kona, tap the station, and then throw the Omniscience down and then kill them from there. It's an interesting way to look at the list, considering some of the other versions that were running tricolor versions, or even going up into 4 or 5, were trying to stretch itself thin in order to do very similar things and run some hate pieces for ways that their deck would get stopped. Jeff, in this case, or some of the other Simic pilots, just went for pure on the stack interaction, which may come back to bite them if other decks start running Cavernous Souls like they are doing themselves. Now, speaking of those other color Omniscience and Kona decks, Bant Omniscience was next on the list of top 10 win rates with a 57.6 win rate overall, going 49, 34, and 2 across 7 different pilots, so some more pilots than just the Simic version. But this is kind of the more stock standard list that we're used to seeing. We wind up running some board wipes in addition to spot removal and seam rips to deal with your early opponent's threats, and then cards like Voice of Victory to kind of shut down what your opponent is doing on your turn, so they can't interact with your Kona and station plan in order to do things. Now, Gabriel Joglar's list, who got 13th overall at the RC in Portland, didn't run any of the Seriema in and of themselves, and instead also opted for Formidable Speaker, which I think is going to be the thing to do going forward, since A, it's a creature, and B, not an artifact, and C, can find any creature, not just legends at all. This sideboard, of course, is a little bit more varied, as we're going to be bringing in different cards to try to change the game plan when your opponent is bringing in hate pieces. Base of the Bounding Spring, Overlord of the Mistborns, and Quantum Riddler are other very solid effects that you normally would expect to see from like a more controlling list. And of course, we have more hate pieces in the side, extra copies of Voice of Victory, Authority to the Consoles, Rest in Peace, and then different ways to interact with your opponent's game plans, from Soul Guide Lantern to Pinnacle Star Cage, extra copies of Day of Judgment. This is more of a combo game 1, control game 2 list, although you do have some kind of awkward instances where you don't have a lot of interaction on the stack in this list, and instead are trying to deal with things on the battlefield. So a bit different than the way that the Simic version is dealing with things. The Bant versions are running way less counter magic and more just destruction or exile effects to deal with the battlefield. Golgari Ouroboroid, which was a deck that I was considering bringing to the LCQs, did wind up having a top 10 win rate overall, as 55.4% of his matches were wins, for a 62, 47, and 3 record overall in the main RC event across 10 different pilots. However, as you can tell by the cards on the screen, there were a couple of different builds. The large majority of these builds were running things that were very, very similar to the Simic versions of the deck, although it ran Overlord of the Baelmerk, a couple copies of Deep Cavern Bat, and just some main deck removal spells, Maelstrom Pulses, Shoot the Sheriffs, etc. That was the normal Golgari Ouroboroid list. However, Kenyon Collins took 78th place overall, going 9-4-2 with a Golgari Golgari Ouroboroid list that look to abuse Insidious Roots, as well as Dredger's Insight and its Overlord of the Baelmerk, in order to put a lot of counters on a lot of its things and get a overrun effect from that, rather than going for Craterhoof Behemoth at all. Now, the biggest part about this is that Insidious Roots, when a creature leaves your graveyard, it puts a plant token into play and then puts a +1/+1 counter on all plants you control, which includes Ouroboroid. So if you play an Ouroboroid ahead of the curve, thanks to Badger Mole Cub or the Llanowar Elves and Gene Pollinators in your list, you can then also Overlord of the Baelmerk, Scavenging Ooze, Molt Tender as an additional mana dork that exiles a card from your graveyard to create mana, Dredger's Insight, any of those cards, and then create a plant token that then puts counters on Ouroboroid, which then get pumped up across the entire team. So that basically makes the Ouroboroid go to 1.5 to 2 times faster than the normal Simic versions. The one thing you're missing, however, is the overrun effect that you get from the Craterhoof Behemoth in the normal lists. Now, some of these lists were actually splashing into technically not Golgari colors for Doorkeeper Thrall in the sideboard. It's just a tutorable version of like Torpor Orb to kind of shut off what some of the ETB effect decks we're going to be bringing to the game, as well as Kenyon Collins actually playing Kaito in the sideboard, which I guess you could get away with some Molt Tenders and Gene Pollinators in your list, as well as 3 copies of Starting Town instead. Regardless though, the Golgari lists were packing more interaction by destroying things on the battlefield, and then some interesting ways to get extra damage across. Bant Airbending recently won a Standard Spotlight Series event, and here also takes a top 10 win rate spot at the RC in Portland, in addition to multiple copies in the top 8. 55.3% win rate overall, and when you wind up taking away the ties and everything from the list, it was 57.1% with a 364, 274, and 20 record overall. Bant Airbending was one of the more played decks in the room that showed up with very good results, despite having 61 different pilots playing the list overall. The combo of Aang, Appa, and Doc Arlok is a force to be reckoned with, as a lot of these Bant Airbending decks have the omnipresent threat of this combo going off, but can just wind up playing a very fair mid-game plan as well, very similar to the way that some of the Ouroboroid lists are going to be playing their decks, because they have the Badger Mole Cub, as well as being able to pump out mono dorks like Llanowar Elves. Bramble familiar with Fetch Quest being able to be airbent as early on as landing an Airbender Ascension is going to be a very good way to just dig for your combo and always have it in hand, while of course Aang at the Crossroads is also a good way to just look at the top cards of your library and find even more consistency throughout your deck. Although one of the big cards that was kind of a standout addition to the deck in recent times has been the Interdimensional Web Watch, which is of course the Spider-Man card that when it enters will exile the top 2 cards of your library until the end of your next turn. You could play those cards and tap the Web Watch for 2 mana of any combination of colors to cast spells from exile. So you can find your combo and then use the 2 mana right there to cast it, or just use that 2 mana to not only have backup combo exiled with it, but then cast your exiled Airbend cards as well. A lot of decks were also packing Avatar's Wrath either in the main deck or sideboard, which is very beneficial for you since you airbend all of your creatures and you want them there anyway, so you can play a dock and then go off for free, but then it also prevents your opponent from playing anything on the board for basically an entire turn cycle, since they can't cast their airbend creatures until their next turn. So that slows down all of those Ouroboroid decks and anything that is trying to kill you very, very quickly. The rest of the game plan is just interact, bide your time, and set up a very powerful board state. 61 different pilots did it extremely well, including Michael Bird's list, which is linked below, who wound up taking home 5th place overall at the RC. After doing some digging and renaming, the Jeskai Flyers list was one of the top 10 win rate overall decks at the event, with a 53.8% win rate in total, or if you take the ties away, 55.3%, despite only having 4 total pilots in the room, combining for a 21, 17, and 1 record overall. Now, some of these lists are labeled as Jeskai Aggro, some of them are Jeskai Midrange, and one was actually labeled as Izzet Lessons. However, this is basically going to be using the power of Momo-friendly Flyer in a very similar way that the Dragons list is doing, except you're basically just going to be playing as many of the Jeskai colored creatures with flying that you can benefit from. So this of course means Quantum Riddler, that's a flyer, Shiko, Paragon of the Way to get a bunch of your spells and small creatures back, but also things like Duelist of the Mind, Nathan Stoyer has flying and vigilance, Clarion Conqueror, great hate piece in the format right now, has flying, Steam Core Scholar, it's got card advantage on its body or card selection on its body, that's a flyer. You also get to run a lot of the same spells that Shiko, Jeskai Midrange, or Jeskai Control lists are getting to run. Lightning Helix, Burst Lightning, Get Lost, and now you also have access to Spell Snare in the format so that you're not just sitting there with 3 and 2 cost spells, you're actually being able to play things early on in the game too. This deck also looks to capitalize on cards that Izzet Looting was running, mainly Frostcliff Siege to give all of your big flyers or casting a turn or so earlier thanks to Momo, haste, or the ability to draw cards when they wind up connecting and being able to build up a big hand of interaction. In the sideboard, you also get access to things like Aang Swift Savior, so you can just wind up playing a bit of a tempo game. Cutsil's Flanker is a flash threat that you can bring on in and exile a graveyard, or just put down as sort of an Ambush Viper blocker. The rest of the sideboard is going to be a little bit more control-y. We have Flash Freezes, Disdainful Strokes, Ultimas, Pyroclasms, just things you need to deal with the different kinds of decks in the format. This is basically a slightly different spin on the Jeskai mid-range list that we saw earlier in the top 10 win rate regardless of sample size. This one has a little bit more of a creature package, a little less of a control-y feel, and actually feels like the place that a lot of these Izzet Looting pilots may want to look if they still want to tussle on the battlefield rather than on the stack. Now, I know that we just very recently were singing the praises of the mono green Landfall deck, but playing the Selesnya version was not a bad choice at the RC either. 53.4% overall win rate with a 117, 101, and 1 record overall. Was played by 23 pilots, so it was definitely more popular than the mono green version of the Landfall deck, but the Selesnya Landfall deck, again, was mainly just running some main deck interaction and a lot of the normal things that the mono green version deck was running as well. We have 3 copies of Seamrip in the main deck, and then sideboard gives you a lot more access to specific removal or hate pieces. Clarion Conqueror is going to be a hard thing to not want to run in the current Badger Mole heavy format. You also, of course, get to run copies of Sheltered by Ghosts, additional Seamrips, or Get Lost wind up going here as well, and then you can wind up, of course, sideboarding in your Felidar Retreat, which now we wind up having Sapling Nursery, which is very similar for the mono green list, but of course this one's going to be a little bit cheaper at 4 mana and can do multiple different things, such as pumping up all the threats you have on your battlefield already. So it's a little bit different than what mono green is doing, has a little bit more interaction, and unfortunately had a little less win rate overall as well, but it's still a very, very solid deck choice if you're considering Landfall decks for your RCQs in the near future. Now, the Sultai Reanimator, or Sultai Living End Superior Spider-Man deck, is something that I highly anticipated being in the top 10 win rate overall, and actually kind of surprised that it didn't even crack into it despite the no sample size version. However, this deck got straight upgrades from the newer sets. The Evoke Elemental package is built basically for this deck, as is Formidable Speaker. So you're able to evoke these elementals, get something like Wistfulness that naturalize exiles away hate pieces like Rest in Pieces from your opponent's battlefield, Deceit so you can thought seize away things that you can potentially get interacted with on the stack the turn before you Superior Spider-Man, and then of course you still wind up having Formidable Speaker to find said Superior Spider-Man and discard any Bringer of the Last Gifts or Arden the Usurpers that you wind up having stuck in your hand in order to just combo off the next turn. You also wind up, in addition to running Bitter Triumph, now have Requiting Hex as a 1 mana interactive spell, since you really don't have any 1 mana plays in this deck whatsoever, at least before you wind up putting sideboard in for like intimidation tactics or stuff. So now you have ways to deal with Badger Mole Cubs, you have ways to deal with Monodorks like Llanowar Elves, you have ways to slow your opponent down before you get to your turn 3 with Awaken the Honored Dead. So this list went way up in consistency and has some main deck ways that are not only good for its plan A, but also destroy some of the hate pieces that decks have been putting in against them. So going up in copies of Wistfulness in the sideboard, in addition to things like Disruptive Stormbrood, you of course get access to your own intimidation tactics, Deep Cavern Bats and stuff to get rid of your opponent's hate pieces. You can then also leaves you extra slots in the sideboard for things like Harvester of Misery or other ways to destroy things and just control the board, like Urgent Necropsy, which is just an all-star Golgari based removal spell in the current format. This deck has gone up in consistency, and I think is going to be going up the standard ranked ladder soon. Simic Ouroboroid rounds out the top 10 with basically a stock even 50% win rate overall. 50.1 when you look at non-mirror matches, and 50.7 when you look at no ties. And judging from its sample size of 1,157 total matches across 134 pilots, it's safe to say that the deck is pretty consistent and pretty good against most of the field, and has an even chance of just basically winning most of its matchups. Now, a lot of the questions that were floating around the RC weren't necessarily, why are you playing Simic Ouroboroid, so much as it was, what's your configuration? Were people running formidable speaker as an additional tutor, the way that the Golgari version can run Lively Dirge? Were you running main deck Wistfulness, or were you still wind up running the Reclamation Sage? If you weren't running Reclamation Sage, were you wind up running the Chomping Changeling? 1 toughness doesn't quite survive things like Iroh's Demonstration, but 2 toughness definitely does. But 2 power doesn't harmonize as well with a Nature's Rhythm as 1 power does. So all these little tinkerings and intricacies and everything were basically the way that the deck was evolving and adapting to the format around it, while still basically having a target locked onto it. Now, the deck, of course, does have very, very fast potential wins. Turn 3 could potentially be the earliest, and a lot of these mirror matches are going to rely on who has the more explosive start, or if you don't, if you're able to Mockingbird copy your opponent's explosive start and then turn it against them. So the Simic Ouroboroid list has been adapting, has been evolving, and has gotten a lot of its win rate knocked off. It's only at a 50-50%, even though it is one of the more played and potentially more successful decks in the metagame right now. If you think that this deck is falling off, you are gravely mistaken, even though its upgrades weren't necessarily as much as like the Reanimator deck or the Airbending deck or all these new elemental decks. The deck is still super consistent. People have learned to play it, and because a lot of things necessarily haven't changed with the new set, anybody who's already bought into the deck is going to continue to play it since it's still showing results. Simic Ouroboroid is here to stay, and you're going to need to have a way to slow it down or beat it if you want to take home an RCQ championship.
So those were the decks that did the most winning, but let's pivot back to the most present decks and see how they did when put head to head against one another. Like winning, but in a different metric. Now, I like to take a look at this specific matchup matrix because it gives us insight into what you should expect to play against if you decide to try one of the top decks, and how it should stack up against your own RCQ, Magic the Gathering, online league, metagame, or any other sort of event you're going to go to in just a short amount of time after this video. Again, keep in mind sample size of these matchups, as not every deck played as many games against all the others.
Now, the Izzet Lessons deck, of course, had a target on his head as the most played and anticipatedly most played deck at the RC, and it did perform worse overall than at the last Spotlight events that we had our recaps on. A 47.9% overall win rate, which actually fell to 47.5 when you took out the 182 mirror matches that got played. Izzet Lessons struggled against a lot of the top presence decks, specifically the other most played deck in the room, the Simic Ouroboroid list, where it only had a 44.5% win rate this weekend. The list did wind up struggling a little bit more against the Sultai Reanimator list, now that it has been packing a lot more of those Lorwyn upgrades to itself. A 43.2% win rate there was a little bit difficult, and it actually struggled a little bit more against the Dimir mid-range deck, so maybe Dimir pilots have some merit to their deck choice overall here, as it did attack the Lessons deck fairly well. 44.2% win rate overall there. The mono red decks, of course, were built to beat it, and in this case here, the mono red decks did better than they did the Spotlight series overall. 38.3% win rate for the Lessons deck, and that head-to-head matchup was a little bit of a nightmare, and the Selesnya version of Landfall in these Landfall decks in general continue to be a struggle for Lessons to compete with. 43.2% win rate overall there. Now, the Lessons deck, it's not all doom and gloom, because like the other half of the top 10 decks here are positive matches here as far as win rate goes. It's still doing decently into control with a 58.8% win rate against Jeskai control. It actually had a 50% or higher win rate against the Bant Airbending deck, which is probably going to be one of the up-and-coming decks to beat in the RCQ style metagame, and it would still be able to pack a punch against the Boros aggro list, which was the other favorite aggro list here outside of the mono red and Landfall decks. 54.8% win right there, and continuing its trend of beating up the control decks, it was 68.8% overall against the Azorius Azorius control deck. So the Izzet Lessons deck, while it was still targeted and was on a bit of a downward trend, the pilots who know what to do with this deck are going to continue to put up results, and some of these matches where it's closer to 50% could be ever so slightly turned in its favor with a couple of tweaks to the deck or just with pilot familiarity with the list. However, not every single pilot has been able to agree on what the best version of the list is, and because of that, things are evolving a lot more. So let's take a little bit more of an in-depth look at lessons here on a quick breakout between Storm Chasers talent or no Storm Chasers talent. If we take a look at the decks in total, it was pretty close between what pilots were packing at the RC. The standard Izzet Lessons package was 74 copies of the deck, while the Izzet Lessons with Storm Chasers talent, which was pretty popular previously, was only at 71 copies overall. Now, the main difference here is that the Boomerang Basics and Storm Chasers talent package really go hand in hand because it is going to be a way to grind out games. However, a lot of decks are cutting down on the number of Boomerang Basics, which means that Storm Chasers talent becomes less appealing. Now, that does do a bunch of different things for its head-to-head matchups, as well as just how it's going to perform against the field. So let's, in general, take a look at how each of these different versions of the archetypes stacked up, again, winning matches between the two decks, against the field, against the meta decks, and just overall in their win rate. And when we look at that specific breakdown, we can see that the Lessons package without Storm Chasers talent is performing better overall than the package with Storm Chasers talent. Now, it is a 49.8% overall win rate versus a 45.6% overall win rate. And when you look at the non-mirror matches, the Storm Chasers talent deck goes down a couple of percentage points, while the Lessons package without the Storm Chasers talent actually winds up going up a little bit. When you look without ties, it's a clear winner in the normal Lessons package without Storm Chasers talent there. But to break it up a little bit further, I looked at how many of the decks that they faced were winning matchups between the two decks, and if they were metagame decks or if they were considered the field. The way that I did this was I looked at decks that were C tier popularity or higher as far as metagame goes, because those would be things you'd probably run into at an RC very frequently, whereas everything else D tier and below was going to be considered the field. Now, the decks played against 52 of the same archetypes out of the 100 that were at the event in and of itself. A couple of these archetypes they did play against, but the other one version of the deck did not, so we're not going to compare those head to head because that's a little bit of erroneous data. But looking at it, there were 31 winning matchups for the Lessons package, 21 for the Storm Chasers talent package. Of those matches, 4 of those archetypes were metagame decks for the Storm Chasers talent, and 17 were considered the field. If you look at the Lessons deck without Storm Chasers talent, 12 of those better winning matchups were versus the metagame decks, as 19 of them were against what would be considered the field. Now, this does not necessarily mean that it is a winning matchup for that deck, it just means that it performed better than its other version within the same archetype. Now, if we want to take a look at what specific metagame archetypes the non-Storm Chasers talent version of Lessons was slightly better in the head-to-head matchup against, you're looking at some pretty heavy hitters in the standard format. Simic Ouroboroid, Bant Airbending, Jeskai Control, Sultai Reanimator, Selesnya Landfall, Boros Aggro, Mono Green Landfall, Golgari Midrange, and the Sultai Elementals list were all archetypes that the no Storm Chasers talent Lessons package did better than its Storm Chasers talent twin against. You can see Bant Airbending was actually a winning matchup for the normal Lessons deck, where the Otter version was running 42.1% win rate overall. It was also more favored in the Jeskai Control matchup and had a winning matchup against Sultai Reanimator, whereas the Otters version had a losing matchup. It wasn't all roses and daisies and everything, though. As you can see here, some of these matchups were just not great overall, including the Simic Ouroboroid deck, where the normal Lessons package was close to 50% win rate versus the Storm Chasers talent version, which was under 40% win rate. If you want to take a look on that flip side and see where the Storm Chasers talent version was actually performing better, it's a little unfortunate that there's only one winning matchup, and it's one that the non-Storm Chasers talent version already had a winning matchup in as well, which was against Azorius Control. However, Golgari Ouroboroid, Mono Red Aggro, and Dimir Midrange, Storm Chasers talent was slightly better than not running the Otter token creator as well in the matchup. Though none of these were winning matchups for the Storm Chasers talent deck, the Dimir midrange matchup was significantly different, very close to 50% win rate for Storm Chasers talent, or again, under 40% win rate for the non-Storm Chasers talent version. And of course, the thing that everybody wants to know is which one of these Izzet Lessons decks was better in the head-to-head against each other. Well, I hate to tell you, it was still a deadlock 50-50, even if you're running different configurations of the deck. It just goes to show that you could change a couple of the cards around, but the main way that the deck functions is pretty much going to be the same overall. You were really looking at getting slight advantages in different areas of the standard metagame, rather than trying to one-up the mirror matchup by taking out your Storm Chasers talents or not. All in all, though, signs do point to trying the no Otter version of the Izzet Lessons deck, since that one did have a better overall win rate at Portland. The Simic Ouroboroid list as the second most played deck in the room, and well, its main most played matchup being the Mirror, still wound up pretty much breaking even. 50% win rate overall and 50.1% win rate when you remove the 166 Mirror matches that were played in Portland. Now, Ouroboroid did have a better matchup against the Izzet Lessons deck overall, as well as the Sultai Reanimator deck, which is pretty solid when you have two of the top 5 decks played, either being the deck yourself or two of the decks that you're actually good in the head-to-head matchup against. And of course, this Ouroboroid list with the Simic style of deck is still very good against the Dimir midrange deck with a 58.7% win rate there, and does beat up on a decent amount of the aggro decks like the Boros aggro deck at 56.7% win rate for the Ouroboroid list. However, the Simic list, since it doesn't necessarily pack as much interaction and has a hard time recovering from a board wipe since it's pretty all in a lot of cases, does struggle against a lot of the control decks. 32.2% win rate in 87 Jeskai control matches is a pretty solid sample size to show that this is clearly Jeskai favored. However, 8.3% win rate in 12 matches against Azorius control, while it's not as clear a sample size, is a more worrying trend when it comes to basically a single-digit win rate in that matchup. So yeah, you beat this deck by stopping it early, board wiping it later, and then just stabilizing and outlasting the deck. Bant Airbending is also a matchup that I thought was going to be even more favored than it looks here on paper for the Airbending combo deck. 47.6% win rate for the Simic Ouroboroid list. I guess that in some cases the Simic deck can just go fast enough, where the Bant Airbending deck does need multiple pieces in order to kind of combo off or stabilize itself, and if it has to sacrifice some of those by blocking early to not die, the Simic deck is just going to overrun it. Now, another interesting thing here is to see that Mono Red aggro, it's a 49% win rate for Simic Ouroboroid. So some of these Mono Red lists, packing a little bit more of the 1 mana burn interaction, are going to be able to outlast the Mono Ramp and Badgermole potential that the Simic list has. Although it is very close to 50-50, it's just a lot more close to the Mono Red side than I thought it was going to be. Jeskai control pilots rejoiced at the amount of Simic Ouroboroid and Sultai Reanimator that were in the room, but didn't necessarily care for a lot of those other standard decks that followed. A 41.2% win rate into the Izzet Lessons deck, Jeskai Control struggled against the most played deck in the room, but definitely beat up on the second most played deck in the room at a 67.8% win rate against the Simic Ouroboroid list. It was 50-50 against Sultai Reanimator, although the fact that you're going to go 50-50 against the top 5 deck in the room is not the worst thing in the world, but it did struggle against Bant Airbending, which is a little surprising considering a combo deck into a control deck. You would figure the control deck would would be able to kind of win out on that end in a little bit more of the matches. However, looking at some of the lists that Jeskai was playing at the event, such as Evan Vetter's top 3 deck or top 4 deck, it was a little bit more catered towards playing to things on the board. Lots of Get Lost, lots of Jeskai Revelations. We wound up having Seam Rips and Aang's Icebergs in there, and 4 copies of Day of Judgment. So there wasn't necessarily a lot of counter magic or ways to deal with things on the stack, even though some of the Airbending decks can get around that as well by just playing like a Cavernous Souls on ally. I think this is actually going to be a little bit more favorable for Bant Airbending, even if Jeskai pilots try to change the configuration around a little bit. It did struggle against Dimir midrange as well. In general, getting a really good Kaito start is going to be hard to recover from when you are the control deck, because unfortunately, Kaito can ninjutsu into play, and your counter magic for Kaito can do basically diddly squat against it. There's also a lot more hand disruption that's flying around the format now. People are going back to deep cavern bats and such, and that's just an absolute house against these Jeskai lists. Some of the more aggressive decks, like some of the Landfall packages and the mono red deck, are continuing to take games off of the Jeskai control list, despite Jeskai again playing a lot of that to the board removal for these specific decks. Landfall can kind of just grow out of absolutely nowhere, and the mono red aggro list, now that they're kind of going away from some of the larger threats like Ohir Axonil and concentrating more on the early aggressive plays and some of that chip damage from Razorkin Needlehead, that's going to wind up being a little bit better of a game plan against what Jeskai is doing right now. Hey, Sultai Reanimator, speaking of, this deck did have a pretty decent matchup against some of the top decks in the room. 56.8% win rate against the Izzet Lessons deck, 48% against Simic Ouroboroid, and 50% against Jeskai Control. That would normally put Sultai Reanimator in a pretty solid spot as far as win rate goes overall. However, if you look at its overall and non-mirror win rate, you're pretty close to 50-50. That just goes to show that while the deck was pretty decent at taking down some of the top of the table metagame decks, it was struggling against some of the lesser top presence decks in the room, as well as potentially against some of the field. Looking at the matchup spread here, we can see that the Sultai Reanimator deck was way more favored against the aggressive creature-based strategies and a little less favored against some of the more interactive or combo-centric strategies. 47.3% win rate against the Bant Airbending deck, which I anticipate picking up in popularity, isn't the worst thing in the world, but 34.1% against Dimir midrange just goes to show, again, Deep Cavern Bat, Intimidation Tactics, these hand disruption spells, and things that can kill its creatures on the board. It's going to be devastating for a deck that is a creature-based combo deck in general. However, Mono Red, Boros, these decks are going to be ones that the Sultai Reanimator list can really kind of combat and take big advantage of. So if the deck gets faster to try to combat some more control coming in, or maybe trying to stop the Airbending deck, if aggro is good into it, we'll take a look at that in a little bit, the Sultai Reanimator deck might be in a very good position. However, if things slow down so that they're trying to deal with these combo decks and trying to deal with these Ouroboroid decks still putting things onto the battlefield, we could see Sultai Reanimator dip under that 50% ever so slightly. Regardless though, these Evoke Elementals are incredibly strong, and I expect Sultai Reanimator to be a top presence deck, if not a top metagame contender for winning. Aha, I believe they call this foreshadowing. Bant Airbending was in the top 10 win rate overall when you look at decks with a 4 or more archetypes played in the room, or pilots playing the archetype in the room, and looking at its matchup spread, it's not difficult to see why. Bant Airbending had a field day against the top 10 presence decks at Portland. The only deck that it sort of struggled with was 49.5% win rate against the Izzet Lessons deck. So it's basically a 50-50 matchup. Everything else was 50% or higher. Actually, everything was like 52.4% or higher. It was favored against Simic Ouroboroid. It beat up on both versions of the control decks in Jeskai and Azorius. It had a slightly favorable Sultai Reanimator matchup, and looking at all these decks that were trying to get aggressive against it, it still wound up beating up on the Mono Red Boros and Selesnya Landfall aggro shells. Overall, the deck had a 55.3% win rate, and when you take the mirrors out of there, all 58 of them, it had a 55.8% 48% win rate. So the deck is a very solid choice. The consistency of its mana base being upgraded already was going to make it a contender, but then being able to play some of these evoke elementals, formidable speakers, just the way that the deck is going to be constructed now to be way more consistent. The deck in and of itself is a force to be reckoned with, and if winning a spotlight event in the previous week was not enough to convince you of it, being one of the best performing decks while also being one of the top 10 presence decks in the room should sell you on trying the deck out. Now, Dimir midrange overall didn't have that bad of a weekend. 48% win rate, or when you take the mirrors away, 48.1% mid rate is not the worst thing in the world. It's still under 50-50, but way better than people were expecting Dimir to be, and way better than it was at the previous Spotlight Series events. Now, everybody thought that Dimir's savior was going to be the Bitter Bloom Bear, which is basically going to be Bitter Blossom all over again. However, the unsung heroes of Dimir were Requiting Hex, Spell Snare, and actually Flitterwing Nuisance, which made its way into multiple decks this weekend, which kind of gave you an additional Enduring Curiosity type effect, at least for one turn, or if you had Requiting Hex, you could do it a couple of different times. Now, the Dimir midrange pilots overall had a favorable matchup into the Izzet Lessons variants, Jeskai Control, Sultai Reanimator, Boros Aggro, Selesnya Landfall, and Azorius Control decks, which, when you're looking at all these top 10 presence decks, is more than half of them, which means that the Dimir midrange decks had to fall off somewhere. Well, the issue is that the Ouroboroid lists are still very good into Dimir, despite having copies of cards like Day of Black Sun. The Dimir decks are way better when they go 1 for 1, or like 1.5 for 1, maybe even 2 for 1 in some cases, but are really struggling when you have to wipe a giant board of things or recover starting turn 1. That's why the Simic Ouroboroid list here is a 41.3% win rate for the Dimir midrange deck, and then sometimes you just have the wrong interaction at the wrong time. So these faster decks, or these decks that can do things that will kind of interact or slow you down, are going to be more difficult for Dimir, just depending on the cards you draw that game. That's why we see Mono Red Aggro at 44% win rate for Dimir, and then the Bant Airbending combo deck, 40.6% win rate for Dimir overall. So all hope is not lost for Dimir pilots. However, you may need to put your pet cards in your sideboard or back into your binder and play the cards that are better suited at interacting with these top 10 decks. Mono Red Aggro did pretty decently overall on the weekend, but looking at the top 10 presence matchups, it gives me a pause of concern for the deck. Now, one of the big things that Mono Red did well this weekend was beat up on Izzet Lessons, 61.7% win rate in that head-to-head matchup, and again, it was pretty decent into Simic Ouroboroid, a slightly above 50% win rate at 51% in that head-to-head matchup, and if you're just looking at these top decks, like, it beat up on Jeskai Control as well, 64.7% in that head-to-head matchup. However, the sample size of Jeskai Control is a little bit lower than the decks below it, where Mono Red started to struggle. 36.7% win rate in 30 matches against Sultai Reanimator, 30% win rate in 20 matches against Bant Airbending, and then looking at some of the other aggressive style of decks, specifically the Landfall decks, it was a 7.7% win rate in 13 head-to-head matches against the Landfall deck. So Mono Red's configuration right now is very good to play if you expect the top 3 decks to be at your RCQ. If you expect a lot of the other decks in the field, or some of like the B and C tier popularity decks to be at the tournament, then you're not going to want to wind up running Mono Red, at least in the configuration that was at the RC in Portland this weekend. Now, if I think Mono Red is in for a little bit of trouble, then Boros Aggro might be on life support. I may have kind of caster cursed this one by saying I thought it was the better of the red aggro decks to win, but looking at this top 10 presence matchup matrix, there's very little to be tooting the Boros Aggro horn about. And then even looking at the overall win rate, when you take the mirrors out of it, it's 39.9% win rate. Boros Aggro pilots are doing something not correct if that win rate is that low. Now, I'm not entirely sure if this is just a fact that the deck is going to be poor in a lot of matchups. As you can see here, a lot of them are in the 40% win rate range, specifically against the most played decks in the room. That doesn't necessarily mean that the deck is bad, however, or it's poorly constructed. It may just be that there were some things that were just not going Boros Aggro's way this weekend. However, when it is this prevalent in the the fact that it is low win rate across this many matches, I do think that the Boros pilots are going to have to do a little bit of tweaking in order to get it back into a state where it can be a deck that you would be happy taking to an event. There's a lot of burn-based damage in this deck, and of course Slick Shot Show-Off is still a very powerful threat. However, everything in the deck being 2 mana or less means that the advent of Spell Snare is going to be very powerful against this deck specifically. We touched upon Selesnya Landfall in the top 10 win rate with 4 or more different copies of a deck in the room earlier, and we know that it had a very good weekend. 53.4 or 53.5% win rate overall, whether you're looking at mirrors or not, and decent head-to-head matchups into most of the top presence decks at the event. 56.8% against Izzet Lessons, 55.2% against Simic Ouroboroid, and 55% against both Jeskai Control and Sultai Reanimator. That's just a pause for a moment here. It is very difficult to find a deck that has that good of a matchup spread against the top end of the field with less pilots than some of the other decks in the room. This was still the 9th most played deck at the event when looking at this top 10 head-to-head matchup matrix, but this is kind of telling me that more pilots should have been playing it, or at least you should expect more pilots to be playing it at your RCQs, because when you start looking down a little further, it does get a little bit worse in some of the other matches. Now, one big red flag for Selesnya Landfall is going to be its Bant Airbending match. Bant Airbending was the other deck on this list that had a very positive win rate matchup matrix overall. As a matter of fact, I don't think it had a single negative win rate matchup in the top 10, which means that you may be seeing a lot more of it, which does not bode well for Selesnya Landfall. Likewise, if there are still a lot of Dimir mid-range pilots in your area, that is one of the decks that Selesnya Landfall actually struggles against, and again, with the combination of Spell Snare and Requiting Hex, a lot of your early game plays are now going to be under pressure, and the Dimir deck is very good at tempoing somebody out, specifically with Kaito and Enduring Curiosity, and now Flitterwing Nuisance added to the list once it gets a foothold on the control of the game. So Selesnya Landfall, if you're an aggro player, I'd be looking at something like this, but do take caution and heed if Airbending and Dimir are going to be more popular in your area. Azorius Control rounds out this head-to-head matchup matrix, and while it is one of the top 10 most popular decks at the RC, it does have one of the smaller sample sizes for deck archetypes in the room. So with that being said, take some of these numbers with a grain of salt, as they may be amplified results of how the matchup actually is going to be going for some of these matches. Like the 91.7% win rate it has against Simic Ouroboroid, 12 matches overall. It's not the smallest sample size, but if you play this matchup 100 times, I highly doubt that the Azorius Control deck is going to be winning 91.7% of them, but you could say that's a favorable matchup. I wouldn't necessarily say it's going to be a free win, however. Likewise, even though it has a lot of 30 or less % win rates here, sample size does wind up mattering. Having 3 out of 10 games won against Sultai Reanimator and Jeskai Control isn't the be-all, end-all for the deck being awful in that matchup. Control mirrors are going to be very intricate, and I do think with Jeskai having more win conditions on average than the Azorius Control list, that does give it a slight favor for Jeskai. Sultai Reanimator, I think the deck does have a decent game plan against. However, the advent of Wistfulness and Deceit is going to make this a little bit harder, so I wouldn't be surprised if Sultai Reanimator stays slightly favored in that head-to-head. The other big one is, of course, going to be Izzet Lessons, 31.3% win rate for the Azorius Control deck in 16 matches. Not exactly where you want to be against one of the most played decks in the room. However, I do think you can shore up that matchup a little bit more by just playing a little bit more interaction on the stack, which I mentioned earlier, some of these Azorius Control decks were kind of shying away from just due to the prevalence of Cavern of Souls and other things in the format that make it difficult to deal with cards on the stack. However, Azorius Control, 43% win rate overall. It dips a little bit lower to 42.9 when you take the mirrors out of it. If you are thinking of cutting the red for consistency, that's just not the case in Standard right now. Portland's RC is going to be giving us a great snapshot of what Pro Tour Lorwyn could look like for the standard portion coming up pretty soon. So Pro Tour Lorwyn Eclipse is on the horizon. I want to know what decks you think make it from Portland to the PT, or if there's any sort of secret tech you think is out there with some of the Lorwyn Eclipse cards that these competitors either couldn't get their hands on or didn't figure out in time for the RC this weekend. Let me know in the comments down below, and while you're there, give this video a thumbs up to let the YouTube algorithm gods know that you've enjoyed it. And if you've enjoyed any of the lists in this video, I do want to take a moment to just point towards my ManaPool affiliate code down below, OTTV, in the description. You can click that link and buy yourself some cards for your latest and greatest standard brew, and you'll get a little bit of a discount on that for just clicking that link or using my referral code. So it'd be really good if we could help each other out here. You get some awesome standard cards, and then we help support ManaPool as an awesome website to buy said cards. And if you do want to support me, in addition to liking that video, you could click the join button down below or on my channel homepage to support me and this video, all the videos on my page monetarily, just like my members. Members get awesome members only perks such as Discord access and a direct line to me to help with deck lists or just chat about Magic the Gathering in general. Also, members only content. I did a series of videos where I was practicing for the LCQs at Portland. We went over why I was picking the deck I was doing, gameplay in general, and just a lot of different kinds of stuff. There's even one video that has no audio or commentary to it that is going to stay members only, since I don't think A, it would do very well in public since I'm not chatting, but B, leave it as a bit of a members perk so you can see me play some games. If that interests you, you can click the join button down below or on my channel's homepage to become a member and show your devotion. And of course, you could always just tap that subscribe button. It's cheap as free, and it helps you stay up to date on all sorts of metagame analysis, deck techs, and in general, Magic the Gathering content from me, like the Pro Tour Lorwyn Eclipse recap that's probably coming out in like less than a week at this point. See you in that recap. I gotta do work.